Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this last day of International Data Week 2022. It is my honor to stand up here and share with you our plenary this morning on science and society, data in citizen science and transdisciplinary research. Dr. David Castle, unfortunately, is not able to join us this morning in person or online, so I'm going to introduce the two speakers who have submitted their talk via video. First will be Dr. Elaine Faustman. She's professor and director of the Institute for Risk Analysis and Risk Communication at the School of Public Health at the University of Washington in Seattle. And then the second speaker will be Dr. Rajesh Tandon. He's the founder and president of the Participatory Research in Asia. Thank you very much.
I'm very pleased to be here today to talk with you virtually, and I'm very sad about not being in Seoul because it's beautiful, but I'm here in the School of Public Health at the University of Washington, where I'm a professor and I direct the Institute for Risk Analysis and Risk Communication. I'm going to talk about science and society, data in citizen science, and transdisciplinary research. And to do this, I'd like to just emphasize that one of the areas that I'm going to talk about in terms of engagement and participation builds off of that context. And the last point here is what specific opportunities can be envisioned to ensure that data science from citizen science is meeting its full potential for meeting our global challenges. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to talk about this and how to go from citizen science to participatory and joint research initiatives in environmental and public health by providing a short historical perspective, some examples of citizen science opportunities, and then moving towards community-based participatory research, co-design, and leadership for addressing global challenges. And I'm going to make a few final comments about challenges to our data community. This slide is obvious. Citizen astronomers have contributed greatly to our knowledge of the skies. And likewise, citizen bird watchers have contributed tremendously to our understanding of biodiversity. And an example of this is the annual bird counts that are sponsored by the Audubon Society and other birding and ornithological societies. In addition, we know that citizen science data makes an input in real time in contributing to traffic applications and allowing us to make individual decision making using this additional information. So it's useful and it's widely used. So why all the issues? Well, I want to say that historically, when we've talked about citizen scientists, and perhaps maybe the earliest examples of these were gentlemen scientists who were privileged, able to volunteer their time and spend a large majority of their time in some cases because they did not need extra wages, and that they would go and investigate the environment, have collections, share this, and become important informal scientists, and maybe some cases one might even argue formal scientists in contributing to our understanding about how we impact the environment and how the environment impacts us. But they were privileged, and this concept of citizen scientists comes a bit from some of this privileged rights that we see historically. I want to talk a little bit more about what the evolving concepts of right to know have really done to shape some of our interests and demands from citizen engagement. These are just a few national and international right to know activities that have gone on. And in particular, I'm going to call your attention to the Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters that was set up more than 20 years ago by the UN Environmental Program. I think it's important to go back to that and look at that to think about this evolution. I also think it's important to think about political theory perspectives on this idea of right to know and how to contribute to our understanding. we've had various models, but the one that I want to emphasize here is Habermas, who in 1987 talked about a deliberative model where people must actively deliberate the meaning of information and attempt to create shared understandings, and I might posit also shared collection of data in order to understand role in politics. This next slide talks about some of the US Academy reports that have defined rights of citizens to know, understand, and to shape research. And I believe that some of these initiatives, which also have had similar types of initiatives in other locations, such as in the European Commission and EU. And in this particular case, what we're talking about is understanding science through analysis and deliberation. And the majority of these particular models show that there are engaged stakeholders and citizens as a part of that stakeholder group at the middle of the construct. You can see on the right, this is one that was used in a commission on risk in the US, where the problem and context that was being solved was defined initially by engaging stakeholders. The risks and options and decisions and data collected to support these, as well as the actions and evaluation, also are done with an engagement of stakeholders. This expectation built and was important in the very process of understanding. So key factors in defining understanding include how information is accessed, what information is needed, when the decision process is open to new information, what options are possible to be involved, what resources exist for an individual to be involved, what options are there for design, and what options are there for ensuring use and application of the data. And these are some of the things that we're wrestling with now with the concepts of citizen science. Relatively recently, due to support by the World Data Systems and CoData for the Citizen Science Initiative, I was involved in a paper that came out called Still in Need of Norms, the State of Data in Citizen Science. Many of these concepts should not be new. I mean, of course, we are all around the table thinking about FAIR principles, but when one starts to talk about citizen science and understanding of the science, there are additional factors that I think need to be considered. One of the things that I want to start with is the definition for community-based participatory research, because this is a particular type of citizen science and it has everything to do with engagement. Community-based participatory research is a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings. CBPR begins with a research topic of importance to the community, has the aim of combining knowledge with action and achieving social change to improve health outcomes and eliminate health disparities. And it's this particular type of citizen engagement that I think is important and that we need to do more of. Key concepts that define participation and engagement, and again, I emphasize that this is especially for environmental and public health data, include the following. So what types of constructs need to be considered within this frame of citizen science? There are various types of engagement. I've just given you a definition for citizen-based or community-based participatory research, but we also have in community engagement versus community participation. We have processes such as environmental justice, tribal and sovereign governmental structures that dictate different types of interactions with communities. And we also have such tools such as outcome mapping, where we engage communities to use geospatial information to construct and identify where data needs to be collected and how it would be used effectively for decision making. Various types of engagement can include volunteers for interest, volunteers for a cause and a greater good, etc., versus community engagement for community, place-based context, for community health versus individual health, and also for survival of the species and understanding biodiversity. In this particular examples that I'm going to be giving, I'm not going to be talking about the personalized medicine initiatives that are going on, but more focusing on community and environmental health in a broad sense. To do this, I want to start with some of the principles that were proposed for community-based participatory research. And so after a decade or more of experience, Barbara Israel and her colleagues put out a critical paper that I think was in the annual review of public health that helped us think about what key principles and policies need to be considered when we talk about community-based participatory research and the data that's generated. It recognizes the community as a unit of identity and builds on the strengths and resources within the community. It facilitates collaborative, equitable involvement of all partners in all phases of the research, and that's an important distinction. It integrates knowledge and intervention for mutual benefit of all partners. It promotes a co-learning and empowering process that attends to social inequities. It also tries to get or diminish this continuum between expert and citizen, and the idea that realize that many people along that continuum have valuable information to share, but we need to think about the construct for how we use that information and collect it. It involves a cyclical and iterative process. It addresses health from both positive and ecological perspectives. It disseminates findings and knowledge gained to all partners, and it involves a long-term commitment by all partners. And it's oftentimes this long-term commitment that has been a challenge for it to be put into place for still a select number of sites. But I would hypothesize, in order for us to achieve many of our open data goals for public, that we have the following questions that need to be answered. So who is at the table during design? Who is determining the questions to be answered? How are the data inputs identified and obtained? Who is designing the projects? Who is defining the inputs the project will be impacting? Who owns the data? How to protect individual privacy and yet achieve community goals? What value structures will be used to define the goals, and what resources are needed to ensure this dialogue? And what power sharing options do we need to facilitate this conversation and data sharing? We all agreed to FAIR principles, but what does this mean in some of these constructs on this? So I'm going to give you a brief example of some of my experiences in the state of Washington. This is presented by Betty Thompson, who is one of my colleagues, who is a big believer in community-based participatory research. I, as a lab-based scientist and a modeler, was, I have to say, not convinced about what this would mean for our research project in the area of a Hispanic agricultural growing region in this case. We involved the community prior to doing our project development, and this was way back in 1999. And we used some of the ideals that I mentioned earlier from Barbara Israel, as well as from Betty Thompson. The Community Advisory Board advised us along the way. The CAB was involved in designing experimental plan and focus. They suggested many things, but even got down to the details of collecting vehicle dust and looking at exposure collection and surveillance that we had not actually anticipated, but yet became a critical part of the study. They suggested an improved hypotheses for studies. They defined the essential nature of working closely with the community members and defined and executed financial resources and memorandums of understanding that covered all data collection and involved hiring and facilitating data collection by the community itself. There were many things and aspects about this project, but I think that I'm going to focus on one part of that, and that was the utility and applicability of the data that was determined using evaluative forms with community participants. And this is just showing a form, and it shows 3 types of data output in this particular case for qualitative assessment. The results of the dissemination were overwhelmingly positive. In fact, we were surprised that over 90% of the participants continued for over almost 20 years in this example study. When participants were asked what they learned, they were able, with high percent correct responses, to identify details about the message and levels of exposure in their bodies, as well as exposure for their children, and explain what to do with these results. We involved an intervention in these studies, and they were very able to look at what protective practices were needed, how one would implement it, and were able to act on those intervention procedures. So what does this mean? It meant that our participants were not only were engaged, designing, co-designing, collecting data in a collective way using Primatoris and the community members as community members, but they were also eager to contribute and participate. It wasn't for immediate results. It was for long-term generational impacts that we saw this type of commitment. So this idea that they could contribute to understanding environment and exposures. They wanted to know this information, they could do and act on it, but even more, they felt that their participation in the design and collection made a difference for their future and their community's future. The second example that I want to talk about is also a WGS co-data sponsored project, and this is a publication of a volume called The Science of Citizen Science, where I was involved in chapter 12. And I'm going to bring an example from chapter 11, but chapter 12, this is an open publication, of course, and the references are at the end. One of the things that I want to emphasize from chapter 11 was this idea of contributory and co-creative approaches in science, that citizens, social science, action research, science shops, and civil society organizations can all facilitate this type of engagement. We have contributory citizen science projects on the left, which are really the majority of many of the early online citizen science projects, whereas on the right, we have co-creation and participatory approaches. And in this case, we're seeing that with this latter approach, that citizens and various organizations that are associated with the community tackle real life problems. They look at scientists as co-designers and facilitators, but they have a shared, open, and reflexive, and I would say iterative research process that engages in this co-creation process. Chapter 12 deals with citizen science and engagement, health, and environmental justice. And you can probably imagine why chapter 12 is at the heart of some of the things that I'm sharing with you today. In this particular case, interactions between citizen science, health, and environmental justice are shown in this particular diagram. This is a figure that shows what EJ, in other words, environmental justice, so that we are not disproportionately impacting members of the community with environmental impacts. And these can be impacts that are from chemicals, it can be impacts in terms of social justice, health and well-being. But in this particular case, tackling issues such as environmental justice require a community and citizen science-based approach to really fully understand the impacts, identify those, and to be able to have an action plan in order to address these. I think the other thing to mention in this is that environmental justice can be a very broad, multidisciplinary process. We're talking not only social science, we're talking about stress, we're talking about health and access to healthcare, and this idea of then how to understand that in a citizen science-based approach is one that we feel requires citizens-based participatory or community-based participatory research. And this involves a variety of levels of engagement, but in particular in the co-design, co-development, co-collection, and co-application. The next slide shows one of the constructs that's out there and is being used more and more frequently, and this is the concept of looking at One Health as being defined as an approach for looking at an integrated and unified approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of people, animals, and ecosystems. This is from the CDC, and at the middle you can see One Health being defined as the integration of healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, and healthy humans, and that one needs to look at that holistic concept of health in order to understand the impacts of environment, to understand the contribution of various sectors and disciplines, but also to understand what this means in society, both in built environments that are rural as well as urban in this. And this concept is gaining more and more traction as we work on projects both in Africa and in Asia, as this is helping to define how we collaborate, how we coordinate, how we communicate, and how we build capacity to do the types of community-based engagement processes that we're talking about. The next slide just shows one of the partners in some of the One Health exercises, and this is the humanitarian open street map, because many of these One Health constructs are done through a process called outcome mapping, where one again looks at the geospatial constructs for the activities that are needed to promote public health and community health. HOT has been an amazing example that we're just beginning to work with, that it was very active in West and Northern Africa and in the Asia Pacific in the regions that we were working on in the One Health initiatives. And this geospatial construct helps us understand and dramatically impacts how we collect data and how we share data. The last example that I wanted to give today is to just call out that in many of these cases, we're using the community-based values, and we've talked about concepts of environmental justice. But I want to make sure that there's another construct that we do not confuse the two previous concepts with, and that is the idea of sovereign nations. And in the States, we have indigenous health communities that have government to government relationships with the US government. And it's been difficult for them to engage communities or their tribal members to collect data that will really be useful at the community, at their community level. I think this paper by Jamie Donna Tutu and her colleagues, and Jamie, I have to declare, as a good friend and a colleague, and I've had the honor to work with her, has done some very interesting publications on the idea of values-driven data, identification, collection, and sharing, and that she's done this within the context of not only the indigenous health, but also climate change priorities, which I think gives us examples in this much broader context for moving forward. So the two references that in general that I use that were supported by WGS and CODATA are one in this book and the other one in Citizen Science, Theory and Practice, and I encourage you to take a look at this. I want to make many acknowledgements besides WGS and CODATA for citizen science projects, but the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, NIH, including both environmental health sciences and child health and human development, as well as the US EPA and the Nippon Foundation. You can see others at the table here with NOAA and NSF, but again, and Amazon and Stop Spillover. But again, thank you so much for having this opportunity to share with you. And I look forward and will participate in the questions and answers here in a virtual format. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I am Dr. Rajesh Tandon, founder president of PRIA, Participatory Research in Asia, and UNESCO co-chair on community-based research and social responsibility in higher education. I am delighted to be able to share with you my perspectives on science and society in this very interesting conference. My apologies for not being able to join you in person, as well as not being able to interact with you virtually either. The best I could do is to share with you this short video from my experience and perspective on relevance of data in science and society engagements. Let me start with a few examples. About 5 years ago, we started a program of strengthening sanitation in informal urban settlements in 3 cities of India. Given the rapid pace of urbanization, facilities for sanitation, both toilets and for garbage disposal, have been stretched. And many people living in informal settlements lack such facilities. The city government, with support from national government, launched a program to provide such facilities to every household. They started with their data available from secondary sources within and mounted a short sample study in order to make their plan. However, city's own understanding, city government's own understanding of how many informal settlements are in a city was limited. They had counted 52. We decided to do a citywide mapping of all informal settlements in that city with support from young people from the settlements whom we had trained. As a result, they discovered another 40 settlements and another 4,000 households. This granular bottom-up data, when presented to the municipal city government authorities, not only surprised them, but it also embarrassed them, because their citywide sanitation plans had ignored these settlements and households. More recently, the second example, during the pandemic, many domestic workers began to lose their jobs. These are women who work as maids, caregivers, cooks, cleaners in middle-class homes around the city of Delhi. These women domestic workers were, when lockdown began, were asked not to come. They could not move. They were not mobile. Their contracts with their employers are mostly oral, and therefore they began to lose their livelihood and could not support their families. Within a few months of the start of the COVID-19, several of these households were unable to bring back those domestic workers. Because of the nature of informal workforce, there was no database available with the government in Delhi about numbers of such households and what assistance they will require. Priya's own work with domestic workers in partnership with Martha Farrell Foundation then produced a mobilized plan where young people among domestic workers' families themselves began to collect information about households on their own phones. We helped them with the format. They collected the information. We supported them in analyzing it. And within a period of 3 weeks, 5,000 such households of domestic workers in and around the city of Delhi were identified with details about their family size and its profile and the kind of requirement for food and other daily necessities they would have. On the one hand, this data helped us mount an immediate relief effort led by Martha Farrell Foundation, but also bring this information to light of policymakers, decision makers, so that more durable programs of support for women domestic workers and their families could be initiated. If you look at these two examples, there are three distinctive features that I want to bring to your attention. The first feature is that communities, households are also knowledge producers. They have been doing so in order to survive, grow, improve their own condition. However, their knowledge, experiential, lived knowledge, is rarely captured in externally mounted research programs. The second feature is that the knowledge produced in both these examples were very concrete and contextual. It described each settlement, described each domestic worker family in such granular detail that other public surveys and research studies externally conducted would always exclude. This granularity and contextual specificity can only come when actors in the communities, citizens in those contexts, become active agents of co-producers of knowledge. And the third feature is that contextually produced, locally validated, granular data on its own is not enough, just as externally mounted academic rigorous research studies on their own are not enough. If we want change to happen, if we want actionable knowledge to be produced, these two approaches need to be integrated. It is important that rigorous research studies prepared from externally academic agencies is complemented with locally produced, contextually specific data sets. And when the two are integrated and harmonized, we get understanding which is somewhat generalized but also actionable in its concreteness and specificity. This approach to citizen engagement in knowledge production is what we call community-based participatory research. And this approach then transcends one-way engagement from the world of science to the world of society. It creates mutuality of respect and acknowledgement of each other's competence in producing knowledge and in using that knowledge both for local action and for policy engagement. I do hope that you are able to see the distinction in these examples from the way much of the discourse on citizen science and societal engagement has become common these days. It is this methodology that now UNESCO Chair is using to promote a global consortium of Knowledge for Change, K4C. This consortium now has 23 hubs in 15 countries around the world. Each hub is a partnership between an academic institution and a community organization, a civil society agency, or a local government. In the partnership, they identify locally relevant and actionable research questions and undertake collaborative joint research. They focus on a number of sustainable development goals, provided they are locally relevant and contextually appropriate. You will find further information of these initiatives that I have described in this presentation in the links that we are sharing as well. And when you visit the websites of Martha Farrell Foundation, Priya, and UNESCO Chair, you will find more examples, more stories, and more articles describing this methodology. Thank you very much for your patience, and I do hope we will find a time to interact in a more meaningful manner in future.
Thank you again for attending, and I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing their videos with us. Elaine is actually online answering your questions in the chat, so I certainly welcome for you to go in and continue the discussion in there. This time we're going to go ahead and finalize this plenary for today. Please keep an eye on that chat. I know Elaine will be answering for just a little bit longer. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to give you a few minutes back. Go get a cup of coffee, tea, or water, and head to your next session. Thank you again.